Hi, I'm Janice Switlo, and here in early parts of season 4, I'm going to refer to Tecumseh again and remind you that back in season 2, episode number 15, Tecumseh the Law is where I spoke of him earlier in the examples that he presented. And today I want to share, a lot of people are getting antsy saying, well, what do we do? How do we do things? And I'd like to remind you of what worked and some of the tactics and strategies that Tecumseh is remembered very well for. And I'm referencing Pierre Berton's The Invasion of Canada, 1812 to 1813, on these quotes that I'll be sharing and commenting on. And it's interesting, there's really no authentic likeness of Tecumseh. He refused to be painted by a white man, or woman for that matter. And so there's a common sort of photo that you access online. It really isn't certain that that's a likeness or not. It's an expectation. So anyhow, again, some of the phenomenal and effective ways that he dealt with the situation, and why is it still relevant today? Because it's the same effort underway. It's still an effort to try to conquer. Anyhow, this is speaking about the difficulties they were having in the Prophet's land policy as it collided with Harrison's ambitions at the time. It was too much because the soldier, scholar, statesman was being outsmarted by an aborigine who managed to learn in advance the date of a solar eclipse. So one of the first impressions, if you will, was how, knowing this was coming, Tecumseh took advantage of that to demonstrate his powers, if you will. But it's interesting because, the level of scientific knowledge about such things is just kind of, it's brushed over. Anyway, he'd heard from, this is, Harrison, he'd heard from Billy Wells, the Indian commissioner interpreter at Fort Wayne, that 80 Indians under the Prophet's leadership, and the Prophet is how he was referred to as Tecumseh, under the Prophet's leadership have gathered at Greenville. Wells, an old frontiersman married to the sister of Little Turtle, the Miami chief, sends a message to Greenville to deal with the Prophet and ask him and his supporters to come to Fort Wayne for a parley. The answer is given not by the Prophet, Prophet is, but by his elder brother, a handsome, disregard my comments that the Prophet was Tecumseh, it was his brother. The answer is given not by the Prophet, but by his elder brother, a handsome war chief with flashing hazel eyes. It is astonishingly blunt. Quote, "Go back and tell Captain Wells that my fire is kindled on the spot appointed by the Great Spirit above. And if he has anything to communicate to me, he must come here. And I will expect him in 6 days from this time," end of quote. This is not the way Indians talk to white men. This is the way white men talk to Indians. For the first time, an Indian has sent back a message that is stinging in its style and insulting in its content. William Henry Harrison will hear from the Prophet's brother again and again in the years to come, for he is one of the most extraordinary native North Americans of whom history has record. His name is Tecumseh. And 6 years later, in the second year of the war, he and Harrison will meet face to face in mortal combat. Recently, before all the quarantine for virus and such, in the last budget speech, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau mentioned that he's going to establish an office of a national treaty commissioner, I think is what he's calling it. I don't really know what it's going to be looking like. But the point is, it's probably going to be based in Ottawa, and it will have, Indigenous nationals running to Ottawa again, or wherever these offices are set up. And it's an interesting point. Whose land is it? It's Indigenous nationals' land. So the places to meet to deal with diplomatic issues should be determined by the original law of the land, not as those with the permissions to exercise limited political sovereignty would dictate. Important lesson on that. It's like any, if you, home team advantage, right? In boardrooms, right? You want, in lawyers, for instance, you want it on your boardroom, not in your opponent's boardroom, lawyer's boardroom. It's a initial starting position of power. So now, here's another example of effective strategy. Harrison, mollified by an apology, there was a big uproar, visits Tecumseh's camp. Visits Tecumseh at his camp. So here he is, he's going to where Tecumseh said, meet me here, on the outskirts of so-and-so, and finds the Shawnee in a totally different mood. The menacing savage has been transformed into a skittish adversary. The two sit together on a bench, Tecumseh talking all the while and edging closer to the governor, who is forced to move over. Tecumseh continues to talk, continues to crowd Harrison, who presently finds himself on the very end of the bench. Harrison at length protests. The Shawnee laughs. How would he like to be pushed right off, as the Indians have been pushed off their lands by white encroachment? So, demonstrating, this is what it feels like. Conveying, this is what you're trying to do. This is in the 1800s. It's happening today. Canadian governments, provincial governments, and indeed lobby groups such as the AFN, FSIN, things like that, they are trying to push you, the Indigenous nationals, those who still hold the power of governance and authority in your nations, they're trying to push you aside. And on a personal example, in speaking of his private life, one woman, it was said, intrigued him above all others. Rebecca Galloway, a white girl of 16, the daughter of literate frontiersmen at old so-and-so, Ohio. She spoke his language, taught him English, introduced him to the Bible, Alexander the Great, Shakespeare's plays, his favorite was Hamlet. The passionate Shawnee fell in love. He brought her gifts, bracket a silver comb, a birch bark canoe, furs, venison, called her Star of the Lake, asked for her hand in marriage, offering 30 silver brooches as a lure. She was agreeable, but made one condition. He must give up the Indian life, adopt white customs and dress. Tecumseh struggled with this dilemma, but his decision was foreordained. He could not bring himself to adopt a course that would cost him the respect of his people. Reluctantly they parted, never to meet again. Being asked to choose between love and who he is, he remained who he is and was conscious of the respect that would accord him as a member of his nation by the nationals of his nation. Can that be said today? How many chiefs, counselors, those who are writing, passing around and not even holding meetings at times, signatures on BCRs, band council resolutions, do they keep such a love for themselves and their people and their nation as Tecumseh did? That's an important starting point. What are your priorities? What is important? Are you putting yourself first, or are you putting your people, your nation? Are you considering 7 generations hence the actions and what you do today? So, one final example of Tecumseh's response to Governor Harrison. Harrison is impatient to the end. He's tired. A plan of action is forming in his mind. He's just so frustrated with Tecumseh. If the Indians want war, he intends to give it to them, whether Washington condones it or not. And he really got under his skin, didn't he? He refuses to negotiate further over the new purchase. That, he tells Tecumseh, is up to the president. But if Tecumseh really wants peace, as he claims, then let him turn over to Harrison the Potawatomi braves in his camp who murdered 4 white men the previous fall. Tecumseh speaks. His response, even Harrison admits, is artful. He affects to be surprised that the white men should be alarmed at his plans. All he wants to do is to follow the American example and unite the Indian tribes in the same way that the white men united the various states of the Union. The Indians did not complain of that union. Why should the white men complain when the Indians want to accomplish the same thing? As for the murderers, they are not in his camp, and anyway, should they not be forgiven? He himself has set an example of forgiveness by refusing to take revenge on those who have murdered his people. Again, he, Tecumseh, makes it clear that he will not allow surveyors to split up the newly purchased territories for sale to white settlers. Harrison responds bluntly, the moon will fall to earth before the president will suffer his people to be murdered, and he would put his warriors in petticoats before he would give up the land fairly acquired from its rightful owners. There now occurs an oddly chilling incident that illustrates Tecumseh's remarkable self-possession as well as his power over his followers. So, right now, there is effort to break up the nation's holdings. This is being done through a community-to-community approach and then wrapping that all up into a by-treaty basis. Canada likes the idea of it proceeding on a treaty basis because that neatly lines up with the boundaries that the Crown is bound by those treaties, so that Canada can then evidence to say, all of this land that, yes, we only had limited permissions before under treaty number whatever, they have now capitulated. They have surrendered it. They have abandoned it. They have given it over. They have signed and agree with us, because remember, this is all full of Section 35 domestic language. They are agreeing that they never were a nation. They never did own anything. It always was ours, speaking from the position of Canada. This is a very dangerous time. There's always dangerous times. You've gotten through them before. I can't help but think how, the appearance of this virus, the timing of quarantine, has interrupted a lot of votes, a lot of meetings. How much are things still progressing? Because keep in mind, Canada loves to conduct these affairs in complete secrecy, despite publicly saying that this government today is supposed to be open and accountable. Not when it comes to continuing efforts to conquer, to try to get the Indigenous nations to abandon who they are and what they have, so that the Privy Council, not elected members of Parliament, but the Privy Council members would have then full control to direct the Queen's then new full sovereign holdings in this part of the world. It's up to Indigenous nationals to hold dear what Creator has given them. And that's all I have to say.